Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in. This is Ian from FIS Cluster Care, and in this video what we'll be looking at is a complete teardown and rebuild of an Audi A4 B5 instrument cluster. Now this video will also apply to the S4 B5 and also the RS4 B5. So first up is the disassembly, where you'll need a T10 little Torx bit to remove the two Torx screws on the sides. Now throughout this video, what I'll be doing is showing you my process in opening these clusters up and removing the previous LCD that might have been pixelated. As you'll see in this video, it's not pixelated, it just lights up, but it's blank. And how to clean that up, and then how to best replace that with a new unit. So here we're opening up the cluster. Now I find that the A4 clusters are a little bit tricky. There's a lot more of those little holding tabs that you've got to fight with, and the best way to do this is to loosen them all up at once. You may want to use little devices such as little thin flathead bits such as I'm using here, or I've also been given feedback that card or like little cut up pieces of membership cards or an old credit card may also work to help loosen up these little tabs. Now once you've got all your little tab unholders fastened, there are two little clips on the very edges of the instrument cluster to undo, and then you're going to be able to open up the whole housing. Now you'll notice that it is a little bit tricky, so it does take a little bit of finessing to get the technique right, but once you do have everything unfastened, the instrument cluster tends to kind of explode itself open, as you'll see in a little bit here. There we go, with everything in the right place and all the right things unfastened, the housing just opens right up. Alright, so I'm just going to show you what this old screen is doing. So just plugging power into the cluster, we can see that the backlight works, which is good news. It's just that the LCD is clearly busted. So the next step, we've got to remove the needles. Now you don't have to remove the two very side ones, the oil gauge and the battery gauge, just the main four in the middle. And my next best tip is just to cut the connection, the plastic housing connection, where the two end gauges are connected to at the main housing. So the needles simply pull off, and then you take off the foils. Set those aside, and then you're ready to take off the white frame. Now the easiest way to do this is to remove the whole PCB from the back part of the housing. There are two little black fasteners just next to where the speedo sits that you've got to undo, and then the PCB lifts out from the black housing. The next step is to remove the white housing, which is connected to the PCB by these little clips. So you just got to press them through, then you're able to remove the main part of the frame. Now the reset stalk also needs to be pushed through. It's quite simple. There's a hole for it, so you've just got to push its legs through the hole in order to get that white frame out. Now you'll notice there's a silver frame around that middle LCD screen. That frame needs to be removed as it does lock that screen down. So to remove the frame, sorry, it is out of the frame a little bit here. To remove that middle frame, all you simply do is shift its legs over and it is able to be pushed through the slots in the PCB. Now we've got access to the FIS LCD. There's just a simple removal of this little rubber bush. Then you're able to start removing the ribbon from the PCB. Before we do that though, there's just going to be one more test just to make sure that it is the screen that's the issue and nothing else, because sometimes when you do remove that frame, this screen can kick in. So there was no change there, so we've got to replace the screen. So the tool that I like to use is an SMD heat gun, and this is going to be the most efficient and safest way to remove the ribbon from the PCB. Now as I'm heating this up, what I like to do is start at one end and focus the heat towards that end, but not staying in the same spot, moving back and forth ever so slightly and lifting the end of the ribbon up with a flathead. Once there's enough heat on the ribbon, you'll literally start to see it pull away from the PCB and you can move along that ribbon with your flathead, lifting it up as you go. So now that's done, remove the old broken LCD and begin to clean up the contact points. So you'll see when you have removed that ribbon, there are many small contacts on the PCB. Now all of these do have to be cleaned up, and what I'm doing here now with my tweezers is just removing a part from the screen or the ribbon that has stuck to one of the traces. So I'm just removing that. Once that's off, I can then proceed with some isopropyl alcohol to clean up all of these tracks. Now you want to ensure that you're not too rough here, as sometimes these can lift off the PCB, and if that does happen, that is a good sign of a replacement that's going to be required. Now, if you have damaged the PCB and the tracks have lifted off it, a replacement unit will be required. You can watch this video on how to read the VIN, IMO, and key data from your old unit and transfer them over to the replacement unit using VAG EEPROM Programmer. Now that the old contacts have been cleaned up, it's time to prepare them for getting the new replacement FIS LCD onto the PCB. Now what I like to do here is use my solder along with some flux to ensure that there's a little bit of new solder and flux on there before joining the new screen on the unit. I also like to prepare the new FIS LCD by doing exactly the same thing, a little bit of flux, a little bit of solder on each contact. Finally, the new FIS LCD is ready to be soldered onto the PCB. So carefully line up the traces and then solder on at each end, and then you want to carefully work your way along the ribbon. Now you can see I am using a little bit of flux here, and that is exactly the key to having a good functioning unit. Just a little bit of flux, not too much. Now that's soldered on, it's time for the first screen test. So I like to test the screen at various points throughout the reinstallation, just because when you do put some other components back on, it can fail, and that just means the connection isn't solid enough. So we can see that looks good at this step. Now that I'm happy with that, it's time to replace the frame that holds the FIS LCD down, and then go ahead and continue with reassembly. Now at this step, all I'm doing is lifting the edges of this protective film. I'm not removing it completely just yet. Just lifting the edges ensures that I don't get any fingerprints on the FIS LCD for the owner. Okay, so that's looking really good. So now the edges have been lifted off of the protective film. It's time to place the FIS LCD screen into its final position and lock it down by pushing the frame, the metal frame, all the way down and re-swiveling the legs to lock it in place. Now that's done, it's time for test number 2, as after this frame has been locked down, again the solder can show that it's not solid and the screen might act a little bit funny. But we can see there that it acted, 100% perfect, so that's fine, and it's time to replace the rest of the components to the PCB. You'll notice as I'm putting on the front housing, there are little black pieces of tape on the clear perspex. Now this is a race car, so they were trying to block off some of the error lights on the cluster. So all I'm doing now is putting it on the inside of the frame. Obviously, you won't be doing this if you drive your car legally, so I don't recommend you do this. And all I'm doing here now is the relocation of the tape allows the front of the cluster to look nice and neat, as the foils are going to hide the pieces of tape rather than them being on the clear perspex. So it's time to place the needles back on, and the most important thing to remember here is that the power to the cluster must be on in order for the motors to reset to their home position. Now, I've found this is the best way to do it if you don't have VCDS, because it's the most simplest way in order to get the needles placed in the correct position. Now, it does take you a couple of goes to get the needle placement right, which is absolutely fine to remove the needle if it's in the wrong spot. Turn the power off, turn it back on to reset the motors, and then place the needle in the correct spot. So as you saw there, it did take me a few goes to get the tacho needle correct, and this is absolutely fine. But now that that's all good and everything's at its home position, it's time to place the PCB back into the rear housing, which is nice and easy. It literally just clicks in. When placing the front clear housing on, just make sure the adjustment controls go into the 2 holes and it should all click into place nice and easily. So now's the time to give the front face a final clean, and I'm just removing the extra adhesive from the electrical tape that was on the front lens before. Almost there at the end. Thanks guys for sticking with me. Finally, we're putting the 2 T10 Torx screws back into their spots. And to finish off the repair, just finally check the new FIS LCD is working properly once everything is reassembled. And it's looking really good now, so it's happy days. Time to send this back to the customer. Thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed that video. If you had any more questions in regards to cluster repairs or upgrades, please contact us on the website.